Welcome in. I'm Austin. Westfall, the Middle East is a key focus of our coverage here at Live Now. And if you're watching this video, there's a chance you've seen our war updates. We usually talk about the news of the day, but the start of a new year gives us a chance to look back on 2024 and lend important context to everything we'll cover in 2025. Dr. Alon Burstein has been with me the entire year. We're going to do our normal thing, except longer. Alon, as always, it's good to see you. Let's get straight into the news. There is so much that's happened this year. We're going to try and hit as much as we can. We're not going to be able to hit every nuanced thing, but we've compiled what we believe are some of the bigger moments of the year, and we're going to try and make sense of everything from January to December. Let's start with the very beginning of the year, January. The IDF posting this a year ago. They say, while 129 Israelis are still being held captive by Hamas in Gaza, Hamas also decided to start 2024 by launching a barrage of rockets at Israel. Alone, 129 hostages at the beginning of the year, they say. There's now 100. There's been regular protests in Tel Aviv. We've been seeing them regularly just about every single weekend, calling for the release of hostages. What happened during the year, and where do things stand with the hostages, Alone?
As always, it's good to be with you, Austin. The hostage situation has been the focus of a lot of developments and also current developments when it comes to ongoing negotiations, although no breakthrough has happened despite all the optimism that has been sort of raised in the last month. As you said, right now there are still 100 hostages that are held in the Gaza Strip. Although when we say 100 hostages that are held, we have to remember that many of them are in fact already dead. The IDF has confirmed that 36 of them are dead. That means that the IDF has gathered enough evidence to show that they are dead and that their bodies are held in the Gaza Strip. However, it is very, very likely that at least 50 of them are in fact dead. This is not an official number, but it is based on how Israel has been negotiating, what it's negotiating for, how it is trying to apply pressure in order to maximize the amount of hostages that might be released. And even when it came to actual discussions that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has had in the Knesset, he said that we are talking about roughly half the hostages who are still alive. Throughout the year, there were lots of different attempts to jumpstart another hostage deal. They all failed, with both sides blaming the other one. The United States has blamed Hamas more for the failures that happened in May and in July. However, has also said that Prime Minister Netanyahu was favoring politics at the expense of a hostage deal at different points. In terms of how the numbers went from 129 down to 100 throughout the year, 7 hostages have been rescued by the IDF in several different operations. 2 were rescued in Rafah at the beginning of the year in February. Then 3 more were rescued in different operations in Deir el-Balah, and then another one was rescued. Another one was found in a tunnel. The IDF actually was not aware that he was held in a tunnel. The captors had abandoned him there, and he was found. A total of 7 hostages were returned alive from the Gaza Strip. In addition to them, 24 hostages, their bodies, have been retrieved from the Gaza Strip in the last year. Now, that's more than the difference between 29. That's 7 plus 24, brings us to 31. That is because at the beginning of the year, when the IDF said 129 hostages are held in the Gaza Strip, they had not actually confirmed how many hostages there are. 2 more were added throughout the year when they recognized that their bodies had been kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip. Thus, the number increased and then has decreased down to 100. So throughout the year, we've had 7 hostages rescued alive, the bodies of 24 returned. Of those 24, the majority of them had been killed on October 7th, and their bodies had been taken back to the Gaza Strip. However, a good amount of them were killed throughout the year in the Gaza Strip, either some of them executed by Hamas, some as a result of the fighting.
So I want to get back to that post that we were showing, because it also brought up another interesting point there. They say launching a barrage of rockets at Israel to begin the year of 2024. Here we are a year later now, Alone. Are these barrages still happening? What's changed about Hamas's capabilities in a year's time?
So mostly what's changed when it comes to Hamas launching rockets throughout the year has been the tactic and strategy that Hamas uses. Throughout the entire war, Hamas has launched upwards of 13,000 rockets and missiles, but Hamas primarily has rockets, not missiles, into Israel. They have some long-range rockets that go all the way to Tel Aviv and even further north to Jerusalem. Most of them, though, are short-range rockets, what are called Qassam rockets, that are, more quote-unquote dumb rockets that are just go up and go down to the areas surrounding the Gaza Strip. At the beginning of the war, on October 7th itself, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched between 3,000 and 4,000 rockets. This was part of the October 7th attack. It was part of overwhelming the surrounding areas and the IDF. Since then, rockets have primarily been used in order to keep the war going, sort of bring the war home to Israelis throughout the different parts of the country. They've also been used in different tactical ways for two purposes. One is when the IDF is approaching an area. For example, this happened today. Yes, if rockets are still going off, 5 rockets were launched today towards the surrounding areas of Sderot from Beit Hanun. Beit Hanun is an area in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. The IDF is launching an operation there as of yesterday. Hamas launched its rockets because they didn't want them to be caught. They didn't want the rocket array that is there to be caught by the IDF. That's a waste of rockets. So they launched them. They launched a rocket at Jerusalem yesterday. That unto itself is very unusual. They don't have a lot of long-range rockets in Jerusalem, and also that was fired from this area in Beit Hanun. So from a tactical perspective, Hamas fires rockets now basically in order not to waste them. If they feel the IDF is going to catch them, then they'll quickly launch them. A different reason that Hamas has fired rockets sort of in different waves, because there's been weeks where Hamas has not fired rockets and all of a sudden they start firing them. A different reason is a show of force. It's a show of force. It's to show that they are still alive, specifically in the areas of Han Yunis, in the areas of Rafah, in northern Gaza. Whenever the IDF has launched an operation in the area and said that it has cleared it of Hamas, Hamas will be sure to launch rockets from that area during and after the IDF operation. It is a signal to Israel, to the IDF, but mostly to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The IDF could say all at once, Hamas is still alive and well. Look, we are firing rockets underneath the nose of the IDF. So all those reasons come together. The barrages are still ongoing, not nearly, though, as intensely as at the beginning of the war. Now they come more in waves, again, for these tactical purposes that Hamas is trying to use.
So, if we're talking January, by that point, the war was 3 months long. The first and only major ceasefire and hostage return had already finished, and the IDF was busy in Gaza. Toward the end of January, the IDF said it had encircled Khan Yunis and deepened its operations in that area. A U.S.-led coalition, meanwhile, was also busy in Yemen. They were striking Houthi targets at the time, and the International Court of Justice issued a ruling on South Africa's genocide case against Israel over the Gaza conflict. So they ordered the latter, by the way, to do all it can to prevent death, destruction, and acts of genocide. However, it did not order Israel to stop military operations there. So Alon, the ICC continues to be a part of this story to this day, with an arrest warrant recently being brought against Netanyahu. How consequential are they, the ICC, in this conflict?
So we have to separate between two different international tribunals. There's the ICJ and the ICC. The ICJ is the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is sort of the judicial arm of the United Nations. That is a mechanism that was set up by the United Nations in order to let countries, as you said, bring lawsuits against other countries. The hope of the United Nations was, let's stop war. If a country has a disagreement with another country, let's sue them. Let's have them actually work it out in court. That is where South Africa brought charges of genocide against Israel, and that was shown before the International Court of Justice. And indeed, at the beginning of the year, the ICJ issued several injunctions to Israel. Chief among them was to stop any blocking of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. Israel was ordered to allow all humanitarian aid to flow into the Gaza Strip without any obstruction, also ordered to avoid killing, also ordered to stop tampering with evidence. But the real tangible thing, because avoid killing is something that theoretically armies are supposed to do anyway, avoid killing of civilians, but the tangible thing that had any impact was in fact ordering Israel to not stop the entrance of humanitarian aid, and that did have an effect. That did have quite an immediate effect. It was following that and several other incidents that Israel started to open passages through Israel itself rather than through Egypt for aid to come into the Gaza Strip. We had the maritime corridor. All these things happened as a result of several things coming together, but the ICJ being one of them. Then there's the ICC, the International Criminal Court. That is a different tribunal. The International Criminal Court is a court that was set up in 2002, and its aim is to prosecute individuals. It is not between countries. It is to prosecute individuals who are responsible for some of the worst crimes in international law: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, crimes of aggression. Before the ICC, anyone can sort of bring charges. However, there's a question of jurisdiction. The ICC only has jurisdiction in countries that have signed on to the Rome Statute. Israel has not signed on to the Rome Statute. That was one of Israel's main claims, that the ICC has no jurisdiction in Israel. The state of Palestine, which while it is not a full-fledged state, does have international status, is a signatory on the Rome Statute, which is why the ICC said, no, we do have jurisdiction with what's happening in the Gaza Strip. The ICC issued 5 arrest warrants. We only talk about 2 of them because they're the 2 that are meaningful, but it issued 5 arrest warrants, 3 of them against the Hamas leaders, Ismail Haniyeh, Yahya Sinwar, and Mohammed Def, and 2 against leaders in Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The charges there are different. There was also an attempt to charge Netanyahu and Gallant with genocide. However, the arrest warrant does not actually say that they are responsible for genocide. It says this was a charge, but there is insufficient evidence. In turn, the arrest warrants that were issued for Netanyahu and Gallant charged them with several things. One, and the main one, is the war crime of using starvation as a method of war. The ICC says there is a lot of evidence, mostly the rhetoric and speeches that were used by Netanyahu and Gallant, saying that they are going to control humanitarian aid and that humanitarian aid is part of the attempt to put pressure on Hamas and the attempt to put pressure on the population. That is a war crime. You're not allowed to use starvation and controlling aid that will get to the population that is in need of food, medical supplies, etc., as a method of war. So that is one of the crimes that they are charged with, and the main one. The other is a crime against humanity, and that is creating living conditions that are designed in order to bring about the destruction of a portion of the population. Again, the same thing, by both carrying out a lot of acts of aerial airstrikes and also by controlling humanitarian aid. How relevant is that to the way the war is ongoing? So the ICJ said is quite relevant, actually. Israel is trying to adhere to those injunctions. The ICC is mostly applying pressure on the Israeli government. It does not have any mechanisms to enforce those arrest warrants. It cannot come into Israel and arrest the prime minister or the former defense minister. It has no jurisdiction there. What that is going to do, though, and what we've already seen it do, is it adds a lot of international pressure to ostracize Israel, to ostracize Netanyahu. Netanyahu cannot travel to countries in the world that are signed on the Rome Statute. Now, the United States has not signed on the Rome Statute. However, Netanyahu cannot travel to Europe. He was supposed to go to Poland for an event marking the liberation of Auschwitz, and he canceled it because out of fear of being arrested. There was pressure that he might be arrested if he comes to France. That is where that does have a meaningful impact on the way the war is running. And the last thing I'll say about that, a lot of companies in different countries in the world are falling under pressure as a result of the ICC to sever their ties with Israel. That's going to have an economic impact, saying, look, the International Criminal Court is saying that the prime minister is using starvation as a method of war. You can't have economic ties with that country anymore. Or you can't sell weapons to that country. A lot of different companies and governments in Europe primarily are coming under a lot of pressure as a result of those arrest warrants. That is where we're going to see probably the long-term impacts of how that influences the war.
You know, in preparation for this segment, I was doing a lot of reading up on the early months of the war, and as I was reading through February and March, I noticed the word hospital coming up a lot. The hospital situation in Gaza is a complicated one, to say the least. There's been Hamas and IDF military activity in and around hospitals in Gaza throughout the war, including as recently as late December. How have hospitals alone managed to treat those who need care while also being wrapped up in military activity? What story is there to tell there?
So the hospitals have been one of the main facets of this war. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have historically used hospitals as staging grounds. They have done that because in the previous rounds of escalations between Israel and, I'll just say, the Gaza Strip, because sometimes it's Hamas, sometimes it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, sometimes it's others, militant actors in the Gaza Strip, Israel largely refrained from attacking hospitals. This is in the different airstrikes that occurred throughout the escalations between the sides since 2007, and also in the invasions of the Gaza Strip in 2009, 2014. This taught Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, okay, you could use the hospitals as a staging ground. Israel is avoiding attacking them because, according to international law, you're not allowed to use hospitals as military activity. So Hamas in violation of that and using the hospitals. In turn, within this war, the IDF sort of decided to break the bank. It said, okay, yes, you're not allowed to use hospitals in warfare. However, if Hamas is violating that, then hospitals have lost their status of being protected areas. And while the IDF is not carrying out airstrikes against hospitals, it is no longer going to give them immunity. We saw this already at the beginning of the war in November, where the IDF carried out a very, very big raid into Al Shifa Hospital, the largest hospital in the Gaza Strip, the northern part of the Strip. But since then, we have seen the Al Ahli Hospital, the Indonesian hospital, the Kamal Adwan Hospital, lots of hospitals in the southern parts of the Strip, in Han Yunis. All of these hospitals ended up becoming battlegrounds. What happened is, as the IDF entered different cities, usually there was coordination between the hospital administrators and the IDF. The IDF continuously called upon Hamas activists to leave hospitals. However, the IDF said due to intelligence, Hamas was still using these hospitals, and indeed it was found that in many cases Hamas fighters were hiding within hospitals, and eventually, one by one, those hospitals have been raided. Sometimes that happened without a lot of gun battles. Sometimes the hospitals were raided, and there was coordination between the hospital administrators and the IDF. The IDF entered, arrested who had wanted to arrest, found weaponry in almost all cases, and then either left the hospital or continued to hold on to the hospital and evacuated the patients. Sometimes, as we're seeing some of the pictures in front of us, it was actually major gun battles. The Al Shifa Hospital, which is the largest hospital in the Gaza Strip, saw a second raid of the IDF in March of 2024. That hospital is now entirely destroyed. There are pictures of it. It is left in rubble. That was the largest hospital in the Gaza Strip. So the hospitals have become a battleground to large extents. Both sides obviously blaming the other one. Israel saying that Hamas has used them, has dug tunnels underneath them, in some cases even held hostages in some of them, and that Hamas has used them and turned them into a battleground, and therefore they have lost their status. In turn, Hamas and also a lot of international organizations saying that may be the case, but the IDF carrying out raids into hospitals is not justified because that is destroying the medical facilities in an area where there's vast need for medical facilities. In terms of what is actually still functioning in the Gaza Strip. Out of 36 hospitals that were first functioning in the Gaza Strip, on the eve of October 7th, right now between 15 to 17 of them, according to the World Health Organization, are still active. So that means that over half of them have just ceased to be operational. Of those 15, they are unfortunately not spread out throughout the Gaza Strip. Most of them are concentrated in the central parts of the Gaza Strip, and Deir el-Balah, and some of them in the southern parts of the Strip. In the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, where there is one of the most expansive military operations going on now in the last 3 months, and lots of injured people, there's currently now only one hospital that is active. It's called the Indonesian hospital. The IDF has said that it has more coordinations with the administrators of the Indonesian hospital and, quote unquote, trusts them more. But the hospital situation is still ongoing. Just now, we're in the last week of December. Just now this week, the IDF carried out a major operation in a hospital called the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Beit Hanun, and on the border between Beit Hanun and Jabalia refugee camp in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. The IDF carried out the largest arrest campaign that it's carried out since the war began in that hospital. It found very little weaponry, but it did find according to reports, it interrogated 950 Palestinians and arrested 240 of them as affiliates or militants of Hamas. Reportedly, some of them also even participated in the October 7th attack. So they were taking refuge in the hospital. One of the meaningful things, though, the IDF put out a statement, this is hours before we recorded this, put out a statement saying they are no longer going to allow Kamal Adwan Hospital to return to function as a hospital. This is the second time the IDF has carried out a raid there. It has sort of lost its credibility as a hospital. The injured people and the patients have been moved to the Indonesian hospital, and the IDF facilitated that. But now we have the loss of another hospital in the Gaza Strip. So it's this constant ongoing situation of Hamas using the hospitals, the IDF raiding them. Sometimes they return to be functional, but one by one, they are no longer able to function in an area where there is dire need for medical facilities.
Let's keep moving along the timeline here. So at the beginning of April, an Israeli strike killed 4 World Central Kitchen aid workers from Australia, Britain, Ireland, and Poland, along with their Palestinian driver. It's something that they apologized and they fired personnel for. Also in April, we saw Iran and Israel for the first time fire directly toward each other. They'd do so again in October, and in both cases, Iran shot a barrage of missiles toward Israel in retaliation for the IDF killing high-profile figures within Iran proper. Both times, Iran took their shot at Israel and basically Nothing came of it. The missiles were shot down or they simply didn't make it. So, what did we learn about Iran's capabilities from these two events alone, and how did Israel flex their military capabilities in their response to these events both times?
So I'm going to start by not addressing Iran, but actually addressing what you said about the World Central Kitchen, because that was a turning point. And it's important to remember that in April, as a result of that event where an IDF drone fired repeated missiles at a convoy of the World Central Kitchen, killing 7 of its employees, Israel came under monumental pressure from the United States and from different international actors. And again, this came in sort of conjunction with the injunctions that were leveled by the ICJ. And this was a turning point in terms of humanitarian aid coming into the Gaza Strip. It is unfortunately a result of that we all of a sudden had the United States pressuring Israel to quote unquote flood the Gaza Strip with aid. We all of a sudden saw the construction of the maritime corridor to allow aid to come in through a port in Cyprus. We saw an increase of the air droppings of the para droppings of different aid packages into the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. We saw Israel opening up the Erez crossing in the north. Now, the situation didn't get miraculously good in the Gaza Strip. In fact, in the last 3 months, as a result of the IDF activity in northern parts of the Gaza Strip, situation has cascaded again in terms of the humanitarian situation. But that was one of the big changes and critical junctures, sort of, in terms of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. So just wanted to address that. Now, in terms of Iran, this war, in fact, was a turning point and possibly the long-term legacy for the Middle East. However, the war comes to a quote-unquote end, is going to be that Israel and Iran are no longer just threatening each other. After many decades where Iran was funding proxies, sending missiles to proxies and rockets and money and encouraging everyone else to fight Israel, but would never risk itself. And in turn, Israel would very, very obviously operate a lot of Mossad agents, would operate a lot of intelligence information and random detonations and assassinations of different Iranian high-profile scientists and leaders and etc. All of a sudden, the sides have been like, okay, no, now we're actually going to attack each other directly, and that may be a long-term legacy of this war. Next time there's some sort of escalation in the Middle East, we're likely to see that this becomes a repeated facet. What happened in both those rounds? In April, Iran fired barrages of cruise missiles, some ballistic missiles, but mostly it was cruise missiles and drones. They are very easy to intercept. You and I were talking live as they were traveling from Iran to Israel. It was taking over 8 hours. It was very clear they were going to be intercepted by Israel, the United States, Jordan, and rumored that also even Qatar and the United Arab Emirates participated in those interceptions. A lot of people said, okay, so this proves that Iran doesn't have the capability to really strike at Israel. I didn't read it then in that way. I don't read it now in that way. That was Iran trying to say the fear barrier is broken. We're going to attack Israel. We also really don't want to have a full-on war with Israel. We'd rather have this as, our strike. And Israel kind of abided by those rules. In retaliation to that attack in April, Israel did not officially even retaliate. There were all of a sudden, several weeks later, spontaneous explosions that occurred in the different areas in Natanz and Isfahan, in different nuclear facilities that Iran maintains. Israel never claimed responsibility for that. So that was sort of both sides saying, yes, we're going to agree this spiral can die down. In October already, it was a game changer. First of all, Iran fired ballistic missiles. Those are a lot harder to intercept. Those, as opposed to taking hours to travel across the geographical area, take 10 to 12 minutes. They can pack a lot more punch. They were mostly intercepted, although several of them did manage to hit several IDF bases. In turn, Israel, for the first time in history, openly carried out airstrikes against different Iranian targets. But that was also not Israel breaking the bank. Israel did not attack nuclear facilities. It did not attack oil rigs. Instead, it gave a very, very clear show of force. It destroyed most of the air defenses of Iran, leaving it completely vulnerable. So in the game of chicken between the sides that has gone to a next level, because now they actually are firing at each other, Israel was trying to send the message saying, we're going to use our airplanes to destroy your air defenses, which is pretty humiliating, and leave you completely defenseless. Now let's see you attack again. Now let's see you again take it up a notch. That's where we are right now. Iran has other things going on. Syria, Hezbollah, Lebanon. Iran's probably not interested in taking it to the next level right now. But that's where we are in terms of where the sides are signaling each other and what they're trying to show their capabilities are.
We'll be getting to some of that later on in this
I'm
conversation,
sure.
but let's keep moving on along the timeline here. So, we've been covering so much in Gaza, but huge story out of Iran coming in May when Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, he was a hardliner, seen as a potential successor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He was killed when his helicopter crashed in a rough mountainous terrain back in May. He was eventually replaced by Masoud Pezeshkian. Later on, as we keep continuing on along May, that's when we can talk about some of the defining moments of the summer months. This was a time where a lot of people were watching Rafah alone. The al-Mawasi attack happened in July. Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in July. In August, Israel consented to a short humanitarian pause, that's what you're looking at right now, in order to allow Palestinian children to receive polio vaccines. A polio epidemic was declared in the enclave in 2024. Alon, what was the story of the humanitarian situation in Gaza throughout the year?
So, first of all, it's important to note that while there were humanitarian pauses for the polio vaccines, there was never a truce or a ceasefire declared. It was several hours here and there. Reportedly, several 100,000 children did manage to get vaccinated, and there's been no reports of an outbreak, a further outbreak after that campaign. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip has really undergone, I would say, four phases in this war, three of them happening in 2024. The first was when the war breaks out, this is in 2023. The situation in the Gaza Strip cascades. Israel launches a complete blockade of the Gaza Strip. No humanitarian aid trucks are allowed in. Then Israel consented to 28 trucks coming in per day, but this is while there were massive airstrikes happening. And that was, a drop in the bucket compared to what was reportedly needed in the Gaza Strip. And that was the story of 2023. That all changed with that first ceasefire agreement. Then, in the first months of 2024, we had, on the one hand, an initial increase in the entrance of humanitarian aid, among others because of the injunctions of the International Court of Justice. But we also had a cascade. We had a cascade because several things came together, seemingly coincidentally, don't know if they were coincidental or not, but seemingly unrelated, that contributed to the development of what the United Nations ended up terming a famine condition in northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Again, these things didn't seem to be by design. But there was the IDF that was invading Han Yunis at that time. Han Yunis in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip. This means that trucks at the time could only come in from the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, could not make it north. Then, as aid in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip got more and more scarce, we had looting of Hamas and of different militants and simply of starving Palestinians who were trying to get to the trucks, also contributing to the amount of aid that was decreasing. We had a complete collapse of the coordination between the IDF and UNRWA. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, is the biggest aid agency in the Gaza Strip. It is the UN aid agency that is solely focused on Palestinians. However, there's been a fraught relationship between the IDF and UNRWA throughout all of history, but specifically in this war, the IDF identified that at least between 7 to 12 workers of UNRWA had participated in the October 7th attack. This led to a cascade in the relationship between them, also to countries stopping their funding of UNRWA. This contributed to the decline. And then there were other things that were going on. The IDF was attacking Hamas police officers, so the trucks didn't have police escorts, all kinds of things, such that in the first months of 2024, we had the worst conditions that were reported in the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Then, like I said before, as a result of the unfortunate incident of the World Central Kitchen workers being killed, we had Israel coming under a lot of pressure, and the situation increased and did get a little better for a few months. However, the fourth stage started really in October of this year, of 2024, with the IDF launching a massive operation in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Hamas, meanwhile, has rebuilt. The IDF left the north of the Gaza Strip already a year ago, in December of 2023. The Hamas has rebuilt. The IDF launched another operation. This has blocked almost all aid from coming to the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. And again, we are seeing famine being reported, and over 100,000 Palestinians are reportedly fleeing the northern parts of the Gaza Strip as a result of these conditions. Meanwhile, the vast majority, and by vast majority, I mean 85% to 90% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are crammed into the Al Mawasi refugee camp. The Al Mawasi refugee camp is a humanitarian zone that has been designated since the beginning of the war in the southern parts of the Gaza Strip along the coast. This area is very, very underdeveloped prior to the war. It was home to 100,000 or so Palestinians. Right now is 1.9 million Palestinians crammed into that area. This has contributed to a complete breakdown of humanitarian situation for civilians in the Gaza Strip. This is why we're seeing the outbreak of diseases. It's impossible to have access to clean water, medical facilities we talked about before. All this is a result also of that intense cramming of people into this humanitarian zone, theoretically for their own protection, theoretically in order to take them away from the fighting areas. However, alongside that, these situations in those areas that are, 10 towns that by now people are living in for over a year are continuing to decrease. And this is something that is another major facet, both in the war in general and pressure that is mounted on Israel, but also when we really consider the anger that is building within Palestinians at everyone, at Israel, at Hamas, international aid organizations. But even if the war ended tomorrow and there was somehow, okay, Israel and Hamas, I don't know, they decide to be best friends, let's just say, and everything comes back. We now have a population that over the last year and change has undergone horrific conditions in the humanitarian zones and in the Gaza Strip more broadly. Most of their homes have been destroyed. All that is going to be part of the story moving forward after the war, if there is that time after the war, for this population and for how the Gaza Strip is rebuilt.
There is no question that a horrible amount of civilians have been killed in Gaza. In December of 2024, the reported death toll in Gaza did cross 45,000 people, but it's important to note that these figures come from the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry, and those numbers have been a source of controversy. What do we know about the accuracy of these figures alone? Do we know how many of them are potentially Hamas affiliates versus how many of those are civilians? Because the numbers don't distinguish between the two.
So that has been one of the biggest sources of controversy throughout the war. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip, as you said, it is a Hamas-run ministry. The Hamas government has been the only government in the Gaza Strip, so the health ministry, wouldn't you know, is affiliated with Hamas. That is the reason that it is heavily criticized by Israel as inflating numbers, as saying that everyone is civilians, somehow everyone's women and children, etc. In turn, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip has, over the years, built a reputation of being fairly accurate, among others because it does not pretend to distinguish between militants and civilians. The ministry simply, forgive me, gruesome, the ministry simply counts bodies. It counts bodies that pass through hospitals in the Gaza Strip and reports the death of another individual. Doesn't care if it is man, woman, or child, doesn't care if they came in with guns on them or if they came in clearly a civilian who was fleeing. One of the things that is often a source of confusion is there are two different ministries in the Gaza Strip that report the deaths. One is the Palestinian Health Ministry, which, as I said, historically has proven to be fairly accurate when it comes to simply reporting numbers. Then there's the Palestinian Communications Ministry. The Communications Ministry is much more of a propaganda arm of Hamas. They are the ministry who are constantly saying, and 70% of those killed are women and children. They are the ones that came under a lot of criticism from the UN, and the UN all of a sudden said it's going to stop trusting their figures several months ago because they saw they were inflating these figures. They're the ones that when there is an airstrike, immediately put out 500 people have been killed before the airstrike's even over. And then after that, the Palestinian Health Ministry comes and says, we've accounted for X amount of bodies. So the Palestinian Health Ministry has been fairly accurate over the years. However, as you said, it does not help us to distinguish between how many of those killed are militants, how many of those killed are civilians. In turn, Israel does not actually publish how many Palestinians it estimates have been killed in the Gaza Strip. It may not have the ability to publish that or doesn't have the desire to publish that. Either way, it does not publish that. What Israel has said is that its estimates are that between 14,000 and 17,000 Palestinian militants have been killed in the Gaza Strip. And I'll also emphasize that that report unto itself is by now already almost a month old. So it is possible that many more already have been added to those numbers. However, if we do take both of those figures, we could estimate that between 14,000 and 17,000 militants have possibly been killed in the Gaza Strip out of potentially 45,000 people who have been killed. Now, there's two more things that I'll add to that. One, that is not the final death toll in the Gaza Strip. There are also between 7,000 and 10,000 Palestinians who are unaccounted for. Many of them are presumed to be buried under the rubbles of, all those pictures we're seeing of the buildings that are destroyed. And obviously, the vast majority of them are dead. So the numbers are likely at least 7,000, 10,000 that are higher. One. Two, another thing I'll say about evaluating the numbers of the Palestinian Health Ministry. Back in March of 2024, it was the only time that Israel alluded to how many Palestinians it assumes have been killed in the Gaza Strip. And this is when Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, during an interview, was asked how many militants have been killed, and he said he would estimate about 13,000 militants have been killed, and that the ratio of militants to civilians who have been killed is about 1-to-1, or 1 militant to 1.5 on average Palestinian civilians who have been killed. That, if we do that calculation, says that Israel at that time was estimating that between 26,000 and 32,000 Palestinians had been killed in the Gaza Strip, of which 13,000 were militants. What's important to note is that figure largely matches what the Palestinian Health Ministry was reporting around then. It was reporting then that 31,000 Palestinians had been killed in the Gaza Strip. So in the one time that Israel did allude to how many civilians it estimates have been killed in the Gaza Strip, that number, taken with militants and civilians, largely matched the amount of people that the Palestinian Health Ministry had said were killed in the Gaza Strip, which is one of the reasons that I say their numbers are, I would say, fairly accurate. We probably can trust the overall numbers. We cannot say, though, that is 45,000 civilians or that is mostly militants. For that, we might have to trust the numbers coming from Israel and maybe do an aggregate of those in order to try to figure it out.
So September and October, we're getting to the later months of the year, Alon. They were incredibly busy months, September and October. The back and forth between Israel and Hezbollah was reaching a boiling point. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, he was assassinated in September. Walkie-talkies and pagers, everybody remembers this. The walkie-talkies and the pagers that were intended for use by Hezbollah exploded in people's hands and pockets. Around the same time, the IDF began taking out a massive amount of Hezbollah leaders and infrastructure. In fact, it led to an eventual ceasefire. What damage was done to Hezbollah this year alone, and has that ceasefire effectively cooled that part of the region?
The story of Hezbollah in this war is very interesting and is really not what either side, Israel, Hezbollah, or Hamas, thought it would be. Hamas called upon Hezbollah to join the war on October 7th, and Hezbollah joined the war, but in a very, very hesitant way, in a way that disappointed Hamas greatly. Hezbollah started launching barrages of rockets and missiles, but far from launching its entire arsenal and throwing its weight into the war. And really what happened between July and September of 2024 that led to what you just said, the sort of explosion of everything and the IDF invasion of Lebanon, seemingly was a mistake. Hezbollah fired its usual, quote unquote, barrage of rockets and missiles in July. One of them got past IDF defenses and, again, coincidentally, landed in a playground, killing, I believe it was 10 or 12 Israeli children between the ages of 10 and 20. This led to Israel assassinating Fuad Shukr, number 2 in Hezbollah. This led to Hezbollah's retaliation, and things spiraled from there. But that did not seem to be by design. What is the damage that's been done to Hezbollah? First of all, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah at the end of September is also going to be one of the game changers of the Middle East. Hassan Nasrallah is arguably one of the most important figures in the story of the Middle East, the story of Iran and militias. It was compared by many to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the leader of the Al-Quds brigades of Iran. Hassan Nasrallah was instrumental in coordinating Iranian activities in Syria. He was one of the people that really propped up the Assad regime. It's not a coincidence that after his assassination and what happened to Hezbollah, the Assad regime fell. He was very instrumental in propping up the Houthis in Yemen. It seems very far, but Nasrallah is the one that said we are going to support the Houthis in Yemen by sending them weaponry. Hezbollah didn't send weaponry, but it activated its different sources in the Middle East to send weaponry to the Houthis and help prop them up. He's one of the most instrumental figures in Lebanese politics, one of the, depending on which side you would be looking from, one of the important figures or one of the most troublesome figures. Either way, his assassination was a major blow to Hezbollah, to its prestige, to the fact that he was seen over the years as untouchable. He has led Hezbollah since 1992. There's been massive wars between Israel and Hezbollah, yet he was always untouchable. And Israel, again, showed, no, you're not. We're willing to assassinate even you, quote unquote. Then we had the fact that Hezbollah's ranks were completely destroyed, both morally, as a result of the pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack. It was shown that Hezbollah is completely infiltrated. And then the fact that the IDF very, very methodically assassinated most of the leadership of Hezbollah, leading to the fact that the current leader of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, is actually not a charismatic leader. There's a reason that he's one of the only surviving leaders. He was not a big militant figure either. He wasn't someone who was high on the radar of the IDF. In many ways, Hezbollah is vastly weakened as a result of the fact that they dragged Lebanon into this war. And this came under a lot of criticism from the Lebanese population, but also primarily because they have nothing to show for it. Hezbollah was saying we're dragging Lebanon into the war, and Hezbollah sees a responsibility to the Lebanese people. Hezbollah was the one, unlike Hamas. Hamas was telling its population in Gaza to not evacuate from the war zones, stay and be killed if needed. Hezbollah, in turn, was coordinating the evacuation of Lebanese civilians from southern Lebanon. It sees itself as a political figure, an actor in Lebanon, has a responsibility. And it said we are dragging Lebanon into this war because we are going to ensure that Gaza is not left alone, because we're going to ensure that the IDF can't do whatever it wants in the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah failed in that mission. And as a result, not only did they drag Lebanon into this detrimental situation as a result of the fact that, thousands of people have been killed, the economy of Lebanon has tanked even further than it was. Hundreds of thousands of people are evacuated from southern Lebanon. Over 1 million people internally displaced as a result of the attacks in Beirut and in Sor and Sidon. And what did Hezbollah have to show for it? That is where they are going to now face the Lebanese public and have to account for what happened and why. That's in terms of the internal politics in Lebanon. Then we have the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon that was signed between the countries, not with Hezbollah. Signed between the countries requires Lebanon to deploy between 10,000 and 15,000 soldiers in southern Lebanon and to ensure the enforcement of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. That's a resolution that ended the war between the sides in 2006. And essentially, it requires that there be no armed presence of anyone other than the Lebanese military and UNIFIL, the UN forces, south of the Litani River. This is the area that is adjacent to the border with Israel. Right now, the IDF is still, at the end of 2024, still in its positions in southern Lebanon, still holding territory. In southern Lebanon, we're in a transition period where the Lebanese military is supposed to deploy and the IDF is going to withdraw. If that happens, if in fact the Lebanese military does deploy and the IDF withdraws and the Lebanese military does enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701, that is going to be very, very detrimental to Hezbollah. Hezbollah has lost its ability to operate in Syria. It's lost its channel to Iran. If it also loses its bases in southern Lebanon, it is going to be in a vastly weakened position. I would argue it may even try to turn more to political activity rather than militant activity because it's not going to have that capability. In turn, it is also very, very possible that as a result of internal political deadlock in Lebanon, the Lebanese military is not going to enforce UN Security Council Resolution 1701. It is not going to have either the capability or the willpower in order to do so, in which case we will see Hezbollah gradually rebuilding itself while it's taking this respite from the war. It's probably not going to re-enter the war, all of a sudden in full force, but it may decide to try to have a display of force, maybe when a ceasefire is signed in the Gaza Strip or not, remains to be seen. But right now, we're still in that transition period. It is due to expire towards the end of January, and then we're going to have a better sense of where the winds are blowing in southern Lebanon and for Hezbollah.
We're looking at a camera that's pointed at the northern Israel, southern Lebanon border there. Of course, activity on this border has been much, much quieter compared to other recent months alone. We got to talk about Yahya Sinwar next, of course. Last time you and I had an extended conversation, it was about Sinwar. And at the time, we were discussing how his leadership would be replaced. It's now been, I believe, over 2 months since he was killed. How has that leadership vacuum been filled in Gaza since?
So Sinwar was in fact killed on October 16th. The IDF did not know that they were killing Sinwar. It's actually one of the more bizarre developments of the war that Sinwar at the end was actually killed as a foot soldier going between different rubbled areas in Rafah, and an IDF drone identified him as a militant and he was killed. And then by coincidence, literally, there are reports of the IDF soldiers who were going through the footage, and one of them stopped and said, "Wait a minute, does that look like who I think it looks?" And then they retrieved the body, and it turns out that that was Sinwar. Sinwar is really the figure of this war. He is the one who made Hamas be what it was. He rebuilt Hamas since he took over Hamas in the Gaza Strip in 2017. He is the one who prepared it for the October 7th attack. He studied Israel meticulously. He studied the Israeli dynamic, Israeli political scene. He was really the brains behind October 7th and largely the brains behind the machine that was the well-oiled machine of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. After the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the other leader of Hamas. In July, Yahya Sinwar became the undisputed leader of the entire Hamas movement. Until then, he was the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, after his death, Hamas's leadership was rebuilt into a committee. That committee, importantly, is not in the Gaza Strip. Historically, there has been a split between the Hamas leadership inside the Gaza Strip and the leadership that is abroad. The leadership that is abroad, again, it was Ismail Haniyeh. Before that, it was Khalid Mashal. Those different figures were the official leaders of Hamas, whereas there was the branch in Gaza. There was also a branch in the West Bank, also branches in Lebanon. The official leaders were those leaders who were abroad. Then we had sort of this development. Sinwar took over the leadership in the Gaza Strip. After his death, the leadership has again gone abroad. It is now a committee. Khalid Mashal, Khalil al-Haya, different figures within Hamas have taken over the leadership. It is part of the last will and testament of Yahya Sinwar. He said in the event of his death, he recommends that Hamas not appoint a new leader, instead that a committee form in order to both preserve the lives of the leadership and in order to have more agreement among the different factions. It's not one leader as opposed to a different leader. And Hamas has lived up to his last will and testament. What is important, though, is that among the committee that has come together, there is no representative who is actually in the Gaza Strip. This has led to a bizarre situation. Within the Gaza Strip, who has taken over leadership is very likely, not officially, but very likely, Muhammad Sinwar. Muhammad Sinwar is Yahya Sinwar's younger brother. He was one of the most important figures in Hamas's military ranks. And after the assassination of Muhammad Def, who was the leader of the Al-Qassam brigades, Muhammad Sinwar likely took over. The Al-Qassam brigades was appointed. The Al-Qassam brigades is the militant, the army, so to speak, of Hamas. He was appointed by his brother, Yahya Sinwar, to be their leader. After Yahya Sinwar was killed, Muhammad Sinwar has taken over. This is very important because Muhammad Sinwar not only is known to be even more radical to some extent than his brother, he is not a political figure. He is solely a militant figure. He grew up in the militant ranks of Hamas. He was in Israeli jails. He was in charge of the Han Yunis brigade. He is one of the most hawkish figures, but he's not a politician. He does not see himself, at least until now, as someone who's going to become the new leader of the Palestinians. He sees himself as a fighter through and through. This has led to a bizarre situation where the official leadership of Hamas is now an external committee that was sitting in Qatar. There's now rumors that they've been expelled from Qatar, that they may be moving to Turkey. Other rumors they may move to Iran. There were rumors that they might move to Syria, unlikely after the revolution, but it was possible. That committee has been negotiating with Israel or through proxies in order to try to reach some sort of hostage deal. However, one of Israel's demands, for example, has been that Israel receive a list of all the hostages that are alive in the Gaza Strip. That committee can't deliver. They're not the ones who know who's alive and who's not. Muhammad Sinwar knows he's not part of the negotiations. So we've had a situation where there is an official leadership of Hamas that is now external, but while it's talking to the internal leadership, it cannot really compel it to do anything. And Mohammed Sinwar, at least until now, doesn't seem interested in a deal. He doesn't seem interested in something that's going to bring about a ceasefire and present him as the victor of in a political sense. He's interested in a military victory and prolonging the war. That is a stalemate that we're in right now as far as the Hamas leadership is concerned.
All right, so let's keep moving on through November. So, of course, stateside, on Election Day, we were talking about who would take the White House. President-elect Trump will take the White House on January 20th. As all of that was going on, as we were in the final stretches of the U.S. election, by the way, the ceasefire deal with Hezbollah was reached. Tensions flaring with the Houthis toward the end of the year as well, still continuing now in late December. Ceasefire talks for Gaza continued, but no deal being made. So, to Trump, he'll officially take office 20 days after the new year. Does it feel like the calculus in the Middle East has already begun changing in anticipation of another Trump term alone?
Absolutely. Different leaders in the Middle East are starting to calculate how they can get on Trump's good side, because one of the things that Trump has proven, he proved this very, very methodically throughout his first term, is that on the one hand, he is very unpredictable. He's unpredictable. If he wants to go a certain way, he can go that way, even though it seems entirely not within the nature of either the US presidency or of his own character. He pulled out of the deal with Iran, which is something that customarily, according to international agreements and treaties, you don't do, but he did, on the one hand. On the other hand, he went and signed a peace treaty with the Taliban and secured the release of thousands of Taliban fighters in exchange for a Taliban promise that they will not let al-Qaeda operate in Afghanistan again, which of course was not honored by the Taliban. But that also was not in character with what you would expect of Trump and his rhetoric about fighting Muslim jihadi terrorism. So different leaders in the Middle East have started a campaign internally and externally to try to make sure they can get on his good side because of that unpredictability. One of the first things that we've seen is Qatar. Qatar, very, very quickly after the elections, started to apply pressure on Hamas and say, if you do not come to a deal, you are going to be asked to leave the country. Qatar does not want to be seen as the country that is hosting Hamas, while Hamas is not reaching a hostage deal. And by the way, it's important to note there are at least 4 U.S. citizens that are held hostage by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Qatar did not want to be facing a Trump administration because they don't know if Trump's all of a sudden going to get angry again. All of a sudden, he'll sever ties with Qatar as a result. So that's one of the things that we've seen. All of a sudden, the Hamas leadership scrambling to possibly go somewhere else. Then we have Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has, again, a fraught history with the Trump administration. On the one hand, it saw the Abraham Accords and saw that there was a possibility of solidifying, getting close to Israel, and that this was a way that Trump was also trying to reshape the Middle East. On the other hand, we also know that there is a lot of tension that has been throughout the years between the Crown Prince and different figures within the Trump administration. And they're also thinking, okay, what's going to be our direction? Towards the end of the Trump administration, we saw Saudi Arabia actually becoming a lot closer with Iran. And these two are historic rivals in the Islamic world because Saudi Arabia was saying if Trump is going to pull out of the Middle East, we're no longer going to get the protection of the United States, which is one of the things that Trump was saying often, that he wants to have a retrenchment and pull the United States out of conflict zones. Saudi Arabia was like, okay, then we need to look for other allies. Let's get closer to Iran. So also Saudi Arabia is saying, okay, how are we going to make sure that our interests are held, that we solidify an alliance with the United States, that we look good to the United States? One of the things Saudi Arabia is probably going to try to do is move forward with the Abraham Accords, because that was something that was an initiative of Trump in the first presidency, maybe a way forward. Then we have Israel. Historically, Netanyahu and Trump had a wonderful relationship during the first Trump presidency. This was very different than the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama. However, towards the end of that presidency, Trump got furious with Netanyahu, famously used words I don't know if you're allowed to use on your network, so I won't quote them, but used words to describe Netanyahu because he was very angry. Netanyahu congratulated Biden for his victory. They have tried to mend fences, but Netanyahu also, I would say, is looking forward to a Trump administration, but also hesitant because he doesn't know. He doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. Trump, on the one hand, has proven to be a friend to Netanyahu and has proven to be a friend to Israel in a lot of ways when it comes to Israel's interests in developing settlements in the West Bank and things like that, on the one hand. On the other hand, Trump also does not want to get the US involved in more wars. He wants to end wars. Netanyahu and his cabinet have repeatedly said they are not going to end the war in the Gaza Strip until this, sort of amorphous uh, total victory that's going to be achieved somehow. Trump does not want the United States involved with the Houthis. He does not want a flare-up in Lebanon. He does not want to have increased U.S. involvement as because Iran's going to attack again because the war is going on in the Gaza Strip. So I'd say that also in Israel, Netanyahu, on the one hand, is really looking forward to a Trump administration, but is also very weary and probably trying to work fast to make sure that Trump aligns what are the interests of the U.S. with Israel. Last one I'll talk about, the Palestinians. Within the Palestinian Authority, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, had a terrible relationship with Trump during the first presidency. It didn't start that way. In fact, Trump invited Abbas to the White House, and actually they had a good conversation, and Trump was then talking about possibly Israel should freeze settlements. However, according to reports, what happened after that in the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, Netanyahu showed Trump a lot of figures that showed that Abbas was not fighting terrorism, that within the Palestinian Authority schools, there's a lot of incitement to violence against Jews, and Trump became furious. According to, again, reports, lost it, called Abbas, screamed, "You lied to me," and that was the beginning of the end of their relationship. After Trump's election, Mahmoud Abbas was one of the first people to congratulate Trump and said, "We'd like to start over. We'd like to start over. We'd like to build good relations." I think the Palestinian authorities also going to try to get Trump to be on their side, so to speak, and say, "You want to end wars. You want to end conflicts, then help rebuild the Palestinian Authority, bring us into the Gaza Strip as a way to move forward." What Hamas is going to try to do, again, it depends on the leadership. But there are rumors starting to surface that Hamas is going to try to also sort of sweet talk its way to Trump, possibly some sort of smaller deal that will involve those US citizens that are held hostage. When there was the latest round of negotiations and Hamas was supposed to deliver a list of who might be released in the quote unquote humanitarian phase, which is supposed to be women, elderly, and those who are injured, Hamas added to the list for US citizens who are not part of the humanitarian side. So they're also probably trying to signal to Trump, say, yes, you have said that hell will be opened if the hostages aren't returned, but maybe you can be on our side too. Obviously, Hamas, I don't think thinks that Trump is going to be their ally, but maybe that he will say that, like with the Taliban, a way to end the war is not to just aspire for Hamas's destruction, but somehow work with them and then pressure Israel. So that's probably
Yeah.
something they're thinking also.
Yeah, at this point, we're nearing the end of the year. We can't do a Middle East recap without talking about Syria. In late November, a coalition of Syrian revolutionary factions launched an offensive against the Assad government, capturing cities, eventually toppling the government in early December, ending the Assad family's 53-year-long rule over Syria. This was one of the more shocking surprises toward the end of the year alone. How has that changed the calculus in the Middle East?
So that really was one of the surprising developments. According to reports, the main organization, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, that managed to launch the rebellion and topple the Assad regime, had been planning it for a while, but was waiting for the right time. And they decided that the right time is not a coincidence. This offensive was launched a day after the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon. Probably they were assuming that Hezbollah was going to be so busy trying to lick its wounds in Lebanon and was not going to be able to help the Assad regime, when in fact that was the correct assessment. Hezbollah completely withdrew from Syria the moment that happened, and Assad was really left on his own. His military collapsed very, very quickly. This is going to be a game changer in the Middle East. Syria is a very, very important country. First of all, just geographically. Geographically, it is one of the countries that connects Turkey and sort of an entryway into Europe with the larger parts of the Middle East, Jordan, Iraq, and a connection through that. into Iran. It is also one of the countries that historically was sort of had, I'll say differently, it's one of the countries that historically its position on the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was very instrumental when it came to where the winds are blowing. In the 1960s and 70s, Syria formed an alliance with Egypt. This contributed to their launching the very, very big offensive in 1973 against Israel. And then, when negotiations started to be between Israel and the PLO in the 1990s, Syria also gave its blessing, and Syria started negotiations with Israel to possibly form a peace treaty in 1999. Then Syria also turned to hosting Hamas and the different, quote unquote, resistance organizations under the Assad regime. All this is just illustrative of the fact that Syria is very important in terms of where the winds of the Middle East are blowing. Now, since the fall of the Assad regime, the person who has become, to some extent, the undisputed leader of Syria, even though he hasn't taken an official position, is Ahmed Ashara. Ashara, who previously was using his jihadi name, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, and returned to his name, has, to some extent, appears to have read the book on how to make sure that you solidify a regime and not let it cascade into all-out civil war. He has done a couple of moves that were very, very surprising and very important. Once Assad and his family fled, and it was clear that the regime had fallen, Ahmed Ashara, one of the first things he did, told all of his militias, withdraw from the cities, and you're now being replaced with police units. That is huge. That is a big signal to say, unlike the Houthis, unlike the Taliban, we are not going to act as militias anymore. Now we are becoming statesmen. We are becoming a police force, and the military, we're not going to keep up the appearance of a militia like the Houthis are in Yemen. He did that. He also has come to an agreement with as many of the different guerrilla organizations and militant organizations that he could in Syria, and has given them all jobs in the defense administration. That is, again, a critically important thing. We have people here who have fought a civil war for over a decade. They have lived their life as militants and they won. And usually, when that's the case, we have these people continuing the fight because they're like, we can now create whatever country we want. Instead of saying, and you're all your own militia, which is what happened in Afghanistan when it cascaded into civil war, he is doing the smart thing and bringing them all into the civil administration and saying, you can continue to fight for Syria, but within the local government, within our new regime. You're not going to be your individual militias anymore. So far, he is going by the book. When it comes to the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian arena, he has said that he does not want and that Syria cannot afford a war with Israel. He is, at least in rhetoric, trying to sort of shirk off his past. And in the past, he was affiliated with Al-Qaeda. He has said a lot of, I'll just say, negative things about Israel and Israel's presence in the Golan Heights. That is one of the reasons that he took on the name Al-Julani, that means from the Golan. He was trying to signal that he's going to liberate the Golan. He's taking a different tune, at least in rhetoric. He's taking a different tune. He has said, we do not want wars with Israel. We can't afford wars with Israel. He appointed a governor in Damascus who went so far as said that Syria should aspire for peace with Israel. That was then retracted by the government. But at least so far, he is signaling that he wants Syria to take a different direction in terms of its role in the Middle East, as has been until now. Will that actually be followed through or not? Will he be able to actually bring the other militias, specifically the Kurds? That is one of the most important facets within the war. They were not part of that agreement that he did with the different militias, and he is to some extent backed by Turkey, and Turkey does not like the Kurds. What's going to happen there and where this cascades, or does it cascade, is the big question of 2025. But so far, he has proven to, at least towards the West, be hopeful that he is going to create a more moderate and focus on redeveloping Syria in a more moderate and modernized way compared to the Assad regime.
Yeah, so let's wrap this up and look ahead. Let's just kind of look ahead to 2025. What are you looking at next year? What are your big questions about 2025 in the broader Middle East?
So obviously the big question is going to be what are the trajectories that the situation in Gaza is taking? The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have been saying for months in different ways, sometimes sort of anonymous generals, sometimes internal communiques have been saying, we're done in the Gaza Strip. We're done. We've done all we can by force. Obviously, if you continue to have a presence in the Gaza Strip, the IDF will find more weapons. Obviously, there'll be more people to arrest. But bottom line right now, it's a cycle. The IDF is, quote unquote, clearing an area in the Gaza Strip. Hamas rebuilds it. The IDF is clearing it again. Hamas rebuilds it. More fighting. The IDF is clearing it again. What is the trajectory? What is the end of the war? Does the war have an end? That is one of the big things that is going to be the question of the Middle East and is going to have a lot of ripple effects throughout the Middle East. Hamas and Israel have been negotiating. There has been a proposal, the Biden proposal that Israel initially agreed to, then retracted from, then Hamas agreed to, then retracted from in May and July. We're supposed to have a trajectory that leads to an end to the war and an IDF withdrawal. Let us just say for a second, even if that is taken to the letter as it is, I don't see Israel agreeing to that, but even if it is, what happens then in the Gaza Strip? Does Hamas take over again? And do we see a return to the situation like it was October 6, 2023? And we have a flare up again within a year? Does the Palestinian Authority come in? Do we have pressures from the United States towards a two-state solution and some sort of resolution to the conflict? That was the Biden hope. Harris said that. Trump has said that he wants the war to end, but he has not said specifically towards a two-state solution. Meanwhile, you have hawkish figures in Israel that are saying that Israel should reestablish settlements in the Gaza Strip, which is obviously not going to be an end to the conflict, but rather perpetuate it in different ways. So that is one of the big questions, and that is going to be one of the questions that leads to ripple effects. The Houthis in Yemen have sort of taken on the role now that Hezbollah had of flaring up the Middle East in response to the ongoing war in Gaza. They are firing ballistic missiles at Israel. Some of them are hitting. They're hitting Tel Aviv. They fired missiles at Jerusalem. Israel has carried out massive airstrikes in Yemen, but that is part of what's going on in the Gaza Strip. If the war there to some extent ends, the situation with the Houthis is likely to die down. What's going to happen in Iran? In Iran, we have a new president. You mentioned that before. The previous president died sort of unrelated in a helicopter crash. The situation in Iran is very, very volatile. On the one hand, the country's economy is in ruins. And the new president has said he's from the more moderate side of the political spectrum, and he has said that he wants to focus on rebuilding the country's economy. He's not interested in getting Iran very involved in the Middle East. And the fall of Syria, or the fall of the Assad regime, and Syria as it was a proxy for Iran, may even be an opportunity for him. Maybe an opportunity to say, look, we can't keep on sending billions of dollars towards smuggle routes into Syria from there to be dispersed to Hezbollah. We can't do that. That may be a good opportunity for him to try to move the country in a different direction. In turn, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, wants Iran to continue to export the revolution, so to speak. So there's a big question. That's another question of 2025. What's going to be the trajectory of Iran in terms of who's going to win? Is it going to be more of a focus on internal, more of a focus on external? Then obviously we have Syria that we already just talked about, and Lebanon. Also important to remember that while we focus on Israel and Hezbollah, Lebanon has its own internal political deadlock. It has not had an elected president already for over a year. Its inflation rate had crossed 90% prior to the war, let alone right now. Another big question, can that country stabilize out or not? And one last thing I'll say, because at the end we were talking about primarily about the Israel-Hamas situation, internal politics in Israel. While we are looking towards the war, looking to all these different facets, within the Israeli political system, there are a lot of different pressures that have absolutely nothing to do with the war. Netanyahu's coalition is constantly being threatened by the ultra-Orthodox as a result of internal political deals of whether they're going to be drafted or not. That is one of the things that actually threatened to overthrow the government. If the government in Israel proves stable, then everything I said before continues to be the question. What's the trajectory in the Gaza Strip? However, if the government in Israel does fall, then we're all of a sudden looking at a completely different arena, primarily because the hawkish figures that are maintaining Netanyahu's government, that are constantly threatening to overthrow it, will no longer have that threat. They will no longer be able to constantly have that position of power, and then we'll see, do things stabilize out or not? I'm sure we'll talk then if that happens.
Oh, we'll be talking a lot next year, Alon. The encyclopedic Alon Burstein joining us today. Alon, can't thank you enough for the recap. We'll be talking soon. He uploads his own regular updates on his personal YouTube channel as well. We'll talk soon.
Austin, have a happy 2025.